This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM.
And Dave on the board, and this is Sunday, February the 17th, 2019, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, whiteways, as it is yet again another Sunday where we get snow and everything else that Dave has been thinking about.
Yeah, kind of nice soft snow outside. I'm going to talk a little bit about planning. Went to an interesting city meeting not too long ago, and we generated last week a conversation about vaping and smoking and how the city or otherwise are trying to deal with that. But also there were quite a bit of planning, and there were 4 items. One was about the Clark Street Park, which is on the moraine, Champaign Moraine, west of Champaign. Another was about a parking lot which interestingly had West Urbana titles. And then there was another one about Bradley Avenue and Oak Street, where there's a lot of traffic, and there's Oak Street runs parallel to the railroad line just to the immediate vicinity of a lot of traffic. Trains are long, and they can take 15 minutes to go past. And that's of concern. The last item was a Neal Street Park, which has been planned for a triangle north of Main and on Neal Street and in Champaign. Let's look at Clark Park. Clark Park is located west of Prospect, and there's, excuse me, it's just north of the country club, and the moraine runs, rather than running east-west, it runs kind of west. The Champaign Moraine sheds into the Kaskaskia as well as into the Salt Fork. The area is higher, so if you have a house on the hill, that's good. But if you're facing the country club, there are some very big mansions there. And so the style of housing changes some. It's sort of middle income bracket. And there's been a move to, and it's fairly universal, to take down several houses or one big house and replace it with 2 or 3 apartment buildings. And they may be individual cottages, but there's a lot of debate about this because it can kind of destroy the neighborhood. So this is happening. There's a large house that faces onto the Clark Park, and it is big enough to put in 3 units. And so there's a lot of debate about whether this should happen. It's happened in other places in the city, and I can remember a site near Hessel Park that was treated in this manner, and the people who live there feel that this is invasion of their right, and the people who own the land feel that they have the right to do what they need to do with their land, and the economic value of it is better as 3 separate buildings. In order to put the 3 separate buildings there, you have to have some variances for the zoning, and so that is a matter of debate too. How much setback do you have, and how much side alleyway, and to what extent is it planted or surfaced? There's sometimes some additional question about runoff. If the 3 apartments have a bigger roof surface than the original house, then you're changing that a little. There were a lot of people speaking to that, and most of those speeches are only advisory, but the city is listening, and it's been a matter of debate for a long time. So there's some people who are rather upset that this is going on and on and on. There are a lot of other city procedures that need to be dealt with, and this is taking up time. There are committees, and so that was one. Then there was a bunch of parking lots.
If I can play producer for a second here, we've got a guest who's just showed up. How about we take just a really quick moment, seconds is all, to move people in so that we can actually have 2 people, not just 1, on the air.
So we have a guest, Patsy Petrie, and she was in the thick of some of the things I'm talking about. We've just been talking about Clark Park.
Oh, Clark Park. Can I first apologize to all your listeners? You would think by now I would have known there was ice out there. It took me longer to scrape the car, so my apologies.
Yes, that happens. It's wintertime.
Yes.
You understand.
Clark Park, tell me what you've covered so far.
Well, let's first of all introduce you to the public. You're a planner and have been so for a long time, and you're an activist. You have been chairperson of the county board. You have helped to start PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Association. You've helped to be involved in the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers. You're interested in infill.
Don't forget the stormwater project.
And then you're sitting on top of the moraine, the Champaign moraine, with daffodils and a little house there that does well. Had a little fire at one stage.
I did.
So, but you're in that area. You're a neighbour.
I am.
And so I've just given some sort of rough summary of what it is to wear. But so these are 4 or 5 things that you've been involved in. You're involved in urban agriculture, that sort of thing.
I am.
And so perhaps sometimes it helps to understand where you come from. Can you tell us Anything about your early life and how you got to be in Champaign? Are you a Champaign citizen?
No, I'm not a native of Champaign, though I've been here now 47 years.
Uh-huh.
And came down from Evanston, Northwestern, before that Stanford, before that Manchester, England, before that Denver, Colorado, before that Muskegon, Michigan, and before
You've been around.
before that Chicago, Illinois. So those are the travels of Patsy.
So you have seen other places and got other ideas, and you're outspoken. And that sometimes gets you into trouble politically, but that's that's quite okay. It amazes me how few people get involved in political action. I'm also impressed by Champaign-Urbana. I just had this week a request from a hunter to hunt on Route 10 between Seymour and 74.
Oh, okay.
It's a very small area. It's like 3 miles. And there are countless jurisdictions involved in that general area.
God bless Illinois' many government entities.
There are 2 sheriffs, there are 2 counties, there are 2 railroads, there are farming communities, there are townships.
There's drainage districts,
Yes.
fire protection districts, yes.
It's absolutely fantastic. And you're in the middle of this. And it often overlaps. And getting back to, now that we know you a little bit, you have a PhD in planning.
Yes.
And that helps.
Yes.
So back to Clark Park, you have an organization there that has been debating for quite some time. And what I was talking about was people who take down a big house and then replace it with several
Correct.
Apartments or houses.
Correct.
And so the problem being that you're looking over a park and the neighborhood is it's not as upper income as a group that looks over the country club, which is nearby. It's sort of middle income bracket. And tell me, in the long run, this area has not only had a park question, but it has had a drainage question. So if you have something to add to the park, that's a sort of simple aspect of this, but then you're getting into the drainage down and across Prospect Avenue and to the basin, the boneyard. So if you have a comment about Clark Park, let's do that, and then let's go to the drainage district.
Okay. First, let me just take this chance. I read some new statistics. It's always quoted that Illinois has 7,000 elected jurisdictions, and actually the new data shows it's 8,500. So we do top Texas, definitely. About Clark Park, I appreciate this opportunity to put some backstory to the Clark Park situation. It's really quite a confusing situation for the following perspectives. Last October, the City Planning Department proposed an amendment to the zoning ordinance that would pertain only to the Clark Park area. Then the City Planning Department decided, and I don't have the backstory of why that decision came about, but anyway, to expand that zoning amendment across the city of Champaign, and the zoning amendment would pertain to SF1 properties that have 50 to 60 foot frontage. And that isn't just Clark Park area, there's some of that in the South Side area, Glen Park along Washington where the new retention pond has been put in, and some in the inner city area. So it pertains to not just one specific neighborhood area. Then laying over that, there were some trigger mechanisms within the Clark Park area of houses being torn down, and then very large houses that covered a whole site built. And that happened in several places. And then in addition, there were houses allowed to be built by error of the planning department. In other words, they didn't meet zoning. The two newer ones did meet zoning, which tells us that the way the zoning is presently written, it would allow a house up to about 4,600 square feet to be placed on those small lots. Then in addition, when that started happening, the people in Clark Park were getting very concerned due to these trigger mechanisms and had conversations with the city planning department. And the department suggested to those residents that there is within the historic preservation ordinance a conservation district subset of that ordinance. That ordinance has been in place for about 2 decades, and that conservation district subset has never been used previously. So Clark Park was making a new pathway for other neighborhoods within the community, and potentially, and in an exciting way, could be the model for other neighborhoods should they choose to want to do something particular to their neighborhood. It would not be the same because the neighborhoods are all very different within our community. Then in addition to that, there is one more layer, and that is what David was talking about, and that is there is a empty space on the southwest corner right across from Clark Park at Daniel and McKinley. And that space was covered by a very large house. That house has been there ever since I moved here 47 years ago, and probably was older than that. And actually the space is 3 lots. So the city's suggestion to the individual who purchased that land and the developer who wants to develop on that land is that it be what is affectionately called a PUD, which is a planned unit development. And the design proposed, though it isn't well defined, has caused concern with the residents in relationship to setback, bulk of housing, line of sight, which would not coalesce well with what has been laid out by the Chamber of Commerce plat, which was laid out in 1903. And if people have seen that plat, it is, from urban planning perspective, it is a wonderfully designed plat with the park in the dead center of it. It's more rectangular than square, but in the center of it, and all the streets focus into that park. And the southern edge, as David just mentioned, is the edge of the country club.
Yes.
And so it's bound by Prospect, Armory, Russell, and depending on how you define it, the south side of John Street.
Let's, looking at overall planning, let's explain to you out there that the city is designed so that you have a city manager, and so the city council can be advisory, but it doesn't necessarily have control over the management. So most of the planning is on by professional people.
No, that isn't actually accurate.
Okay.
It is
Straighten me out.
Well, you know the answer. You're doing that to help your listeners better understand how decisions are made in the city of Champaign as compared to Urbana. You are correct. It's a city manager form of government, and that means that it's a weak mayor as compared to Urbana, where it's a strong mayor form of government. And the city council has the last word. They are the final decision makers, and everything goes to them. They can hire and fire. They can appoint to commissions, so they have that authority by the way the statute is written for city manager form of government. the process and procedure for all of the three aspects, three layers that are going on within that particular boundary of the Chamber of Commerce plat are the following. First, it went to the Historic Preservation Commission, and that oversees that ordinance. And they passed it forward to the Planning Commission. Both of these commissions, the members thereof, are appointed by the City Council, advice and consent. The mayor might choose them from applications, but the advice and consent comes from the City Council. The Planning Commission did not vote favorably on the Conservation District. However, by the rules for the Planning Commission, it had to be passed to the City Council. When it got to the City Council, there was much robust conversation. It did not pass, and the end result is that it has gone back to the Planning Department for more conversation, and the members, the residents who live in the Clark Park area are working with the Planning Department at the city to see how we can move forward. Now, speaking only solely now as an urban planner, what needs to really be straightened out first is the zoning ordinance, the amendment to the zoning ordinance. And until that gets straightened out, you can hardly move forward either on a conservation district or a planned unit development, because in zoning language, both of those will lay over. They're overlays. They lay over the present zoning ordinance. So that is a means and way to adjust a zoning ordinance or fine-tune a zoning ordinance in certain means to accommodate things that are going on in particular areas of any community, not just here. It's a tool in the toolbox of urban planning. And actually, I find it very exciting to think about what other neighborhoods could do or how they could use the conservation district part of the historic preservation ordinance in preserving characteristics of their neighborhoods. Because, as I said before, I think it's very fortunate that we have such a variety of different neighborhoods throughout Champaign.
Part of the problem here is that we're a very young city. It's go back to divvying up between Vermilion County and Champaign County, and then this is only in the 1830s and 1940s and 1850s, which is not that long ago. So people had to put together the concept of a railroad coming through, and then there's people buying land, and there was a West Side Park, which was a hope that it would be the Champaign County seat. When Urbana wanted to keep that.
Right. Urbana got the county seat, that's correct.
And Urbana didn't do like many towns did. They didn't slide their buildings over to Champaign and create a new town. So there's a separation between the two towns, which is sometimes a little antagonistic.
Well, it makes for very interesting planning. And when I was teaching urban planning, I always mentioned, or we had conversations in class, that anything that is done to any site, be it a residential or a business or anything, has fallout and affects everything around that site. So that could very comfortably lead into your next topic of the John Street Watershed Project.
Yes, you're on top of the watershed. You don't get to be covered with water.
Yeah.
But at the bottom end of this water was going down into the boneyard. And the campus, in a good storm, you could float a boat in Green Street. And so...
Lake Neal.
Yes. Well, the Lake Neal was further south on Neal Street, and it had a tributary into the campus town, too.
Right.
So this took many years to put this together because there are many different jurisdictions. And the concept was to put in a basin. And
that's right. That's the basin that is just east of the railroad track.
Second Street.
No, well, you're talking about the Second Street Reach,
Yes.
but that's part of that. But the big hole or the big dig, which is where all the water from John Street goes. John Street doesn't go into the Second Street
Oh,
Reach.
I know. Okay.
Just to clarify that
Yes.
that separation, sometimes though that big dig or basin or whatever you want to call it, which is just east of the railroad tracks, even in our worst floods like 2012, which we had, and everything in God's green earth flooded during that. That was in June, twice in June on the Saturday. On Saturdays, very rarely is that totally full to the top. That's a really deep basin.
Yes.
And so,
It's a kind of square basin compared with the Big Dig, which is more landscaped.
yes, the landscape, the Second Street Reach, and where they have also put a pump station fairly recently, and the purpose of the pump station is to handle what is going to be draining off the land, because so much of the permeable surface has now become impermeable throughout, say, from University to Green, and say from the railroad tracks going east to 6. So they had to do something to help handle that water as it is rushing through there into the Second Street Reach, which then is allowed, when it gets too full, by pumps to go into the Boneyard and move east into Urbana.
Yes, and then
Just to help people understand how that engineering design was
when
done.
it gets to Urbana, it has usually a river rises and it has a floodplain.
Right.
And this has been more or less put into a sewer with steel edges.
Correct.
And that river, creek, whatever you call it, boneyard, has to take the volume of water that's coming off of your area to the west of Champaign.
That is correct, and you know, there are times when we've had what's been are defined or described as 100-year floods, but we've had them a number of times in a row. So the infrastructure gets so full that it can't take anymore. That's what happened in 2012 when my house flooded. It had never flooded in the basement before.
Oh, and you're high.
And I'm high. I'm at a high point. That's right. And I had 8 to 10 inches of water in the basement for probably about 10 hours because the infrastructure was so full. And when the city came to check the infrastructure, as they said, it's moving. You could see this itsy bitsy tiny eye that was showing that water was moving, but it wasn't moving very fast. So I kid people when people say go out and clear the street drains, and I keep saying don't go out and clear the street drains.
It's not going to go anywhere.
Because then it'll move through too fast. Give the infrastructure time to, level off a little bit so more can go into that. And then the other thing we were, after the fact, laughing about when we were flooding so badly those 2 Saturdays in June of 2012 is that everybody a little bit higher going to Russell Street where the water tower is, which is the highest point, were still running their washing machine, taking showers, using the bathroom, and they were just running water into the infrastructure when they could.
This is interesting. So if you're interested in working with the city.
Quick question. How much higher are they at Russell where the water tower is than you? Like 8 to 10 inches higher? Is that all it took for them to not get any flooding?
It is probably about, they're probably about, I would say between 8 and 12 inches higher. But I'm up on a hill.
Right, but so they had the water at the same level under them. It's just being that 8 inches higher than you were, it was just below them where you got it in your basement.
Right,
roughly.
And it was filling the infrastructure. So it's like anything that goes on when the infrastructure starts filling, the water goes to the path of least resistance. And so if you have drainage tiles in your yard, because old construction took the downspouts into underground drainage, which then went into the city infrastructure. Well, then that's backing up, and then the soil got super saturated, and it was pressure bringing things in through walls, but it also, as people said, came through any orifice that was in the basement.
So there were a lot of citizens out there looking into sewer holes to see how the water was flowing, and
It was
taking records. And so this is the first stage of discussion.
Well, that's the first stage, but it's also the importance of making sure that the infrastructure is always clean, because once the roots get in there, and then we have a lot of sweet gum trees, which are pretty trees, but they drop those wonderful balls with all those little pricklies that come out, and they go down into the drain, and then they get caught in the roots, and it's like a dam.
So the other end of this is Sydney, which cups a lot of the water and floods a meander in Sydney. So there's a temptation early on in settlement to channelize, to straighten these streams. So this is not just a problem for people on the west side of Prospect Avenue in Champaign. It goes all the way down to the Vermilion and into the Wabash and into the Ohio and into the Mississippi.
That's a good reminder for everybody to remember that actually in Champaign County there are 5 streams going out, which, as you just mentioned, end up coming together down in Cairo.
Yes.
And that's really, not many people keep that in the front of their memory. Probably a lot of people know it, but it isn't, minute it rains, you don't think, oh, that's going to end up in Cairo.
But it doesn't end up in Cairo either. It goes to the Gulf.
Well, eventually, yes.
And if you put pollutants in there,
then we have the problem down the Gulf.
In the Gulf,
yes.
You have epoxy.
Yes, we have epoxy down there, which is causing that's Katrina in New Orleans and all that.
Okay, so we eventually have a lot of real estate that was taken out and replaced with 2 different big digs.
Well, there was, and that was because we are a swamp, as you're referring to. And for people who don't know this, John Street is a covered stream. In fact, we know where the beginning of that stream is, which is on the southwest corner of Clark Park. You can go and identify it. And so it's like, that's a lesson.
Even the boneyard going through the university is covered over completely.
Yes,
2
it is.
Big 8-foot drains. You could walk through them. Flood time, it's not enough to take.
That's right. So we are a swamp.
Yes.
And so we aren't planning in our building as if we are a swamp, is the biggest theme that you and I talk about a lot. And that is every time we cover permeable surface, remember we were farmland, you remember, but your listeners remember it was farmland, and that was all permeable surface. We start covering it, so then that water runs, and we have not, in Champaign at least, and I don't remember, maybe you do if Urbana's done this, but every time you cover permeable surface and it becomes impermeable, then there needs to be an ordinance that roughly states the shed off that site can be no greater than it was when it was permeable surface. And there are many mechanisms that can come into design that will hold the water back. So there's a whole new paradigm of stormwater management, and is that holding it on the site, not making big retention ponds, which has been the solution throughout the county and drainage districts out in the rural area and things of that nature. But now it's hold it back on the site and then release it slowly, because then the infrastructure can take it. The infrastructure in the John Street watershed project was only 8 inches, and it's still only 8 inches in the area that I live in. And just to be clear to your listeners, technically I do not live in the Clark Park area. I live just 2 streets north of that.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I just want your listeners.
You're on the
to
same
know that.
marine.
But I'm in the area, and I worked on the John Street Watershed Project, as did. It was 6 to 8 of us that were the instigators on starting that flooding management project, which then was a model planning project. It's a casebook model planning project, and then it went to East Washington, West Washington, Glen Park. So those are completed, and now there are 3 more on the drawing board. It is the area along University Avenue west of Dr. Howard, which floods a lot. There's no infrastructure under that. Ennis, which is right across Springfield from where I live, they don't have infrastructure. The Garden Hills area, and when they do Garden Hills, they're doing sidewalks, lighting, and flooding management. And when Bristol Park is going to be starting very soon, and that ground's going to be opened up. So they are going to go in and do stormwater management and put big pipes in the Bristol Park area. So those 3 are on the drawing board.
That's interesting. Let's go to Bristol Park.
Yes.
One of the topics discussed was Oak Street.
Yes.
And Oak Street runs parallel to the railroad line. It goes kitty corner. It's not your Jeffersonian Platte. It's a railroad going through it diagonal, so you have a railroad Platte and as well as a Jeffersonian Platte.
Yes.
The Jeffersonian Platte is Bradley Avenue. And I wondered, as I was sitting there listening to this discussion, whether 4th Street was going to be used instead of Oak Street, and that was going to be able to make an S-shaped bridge over Bradley Avenue, because one of the problems that public transportation is finding is that there are trains that are up to 200 miles long, 200 vehicles long, and there's a slight rise in Champaign because when traffic came in early, they went to Paxton and took down a moraine and cut through a moraine and brought the soil down here. And so the trains have a little hard time starting off from Bradley Avenue area. So it's very slow. You could sit there for an hour.
I got caught the other night.
So cars turn around and go.
They did? They were doing that?
So now I didn't hear a mention of that in the city debate, but I was thinking, this is the time when you look for an S-shaped bridge. There's land to the south, there's Bristol Park to the north, and I wondered, is this being planned through Bristol Park? Is in 30 years' time, we'll be taking out houses on Bristol Park in order to make a loop over the railroad so the traffic can move rather than sit there with their engines pushing out pollutants and getting very frustrated.
Right, and if I could push your idea just a little bit north to the development that is going on as we speak along the railroad track embankment behind the Living Church of God and spanning Champaign and Urbana. So then we've got a lot of traffic going into that whole area of what you're talking about. And so we're going to have, we'll have to think out, as you're pointing out, of how are we going to smooth out traffic, because as you mentioned, people get frustrated sitting there at the railroad tracks and just drop their center wheel and turn around and go back. And so that's human behavior. I mean, that's just human behavior as we do transportation design.
Well, this is a major drag, and it's interesting that the other end of it, when you get to Bloomington Road, is more or less an old Indian trail. And it was one of the early offshoots of settlers coming through. And it's maintained. And it's maintained all the way to Bloomington. So that's taking traffic. It's an alternate one. It gets you onto 150, is it? Yes, I think it's 150.
Right.
Parallels to 74.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of traffic on that. So you're talking at a major artery that is Bradley Avenue.
Well, it's going to be, well, yes, it's going to be a choke point there at Prospect where it splits. And so that'll be something that'll have to be talked about. And crossing the highway there to go out to the Market Street area, that's a very narrow bridge, as everybody has experienced at Christmas time, as a matter of fact, as people are going out there to shop. So you've got a narrow overpass over the freeway, on and off ramps. You have Bradley and Bloomington and Prospect coming in there. So it will be, and I don't know if that's on IDOT's radar or not. I haven't heard that one talked about.
At some stages, there has been a move to put Bradley Avenue straight through Busey Woods and come out on 45, so you've got another connection. But let's look at Neal Street is right there too.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
a little east, yes.
Neal Street is coming off of 74, and it's a narrow street. And so you have at the end of it downtown Champaign, Main
Correct.
Street, and
Correct.
so there's one of these triangular plots that result from having a Neal Street, which is
Oh, you mean that
Jefferson
area that they want to,
develop
they want to develop.
as a park. And,
Yes.
and it's needed because we have so much high rise and so much activity, and not very many niches. We've just lost our niche over the way, which was a prairie niche.
Yes, I read that you lost your prairie
Yes.
there, yeah.
So, but the city needs those sorts of spaces.
Well, if you're a Jensen landscape architect, yes, very much so. You need breathing space. However, there is not sufficient sensitivity in design for those people who have mobility issues. And the designs that I've seen for that space, my comments that I have shared are concerns with people's mobility. The deflection is to the parking garage that is to the west of that area. But if you have mobility issues, then that becomes a challenge because you're crossing Neal at a choke point there, though, so people have slowed down. There's no question about that. But if anything you want to get to that might be developed, or if you want to get further in to the downtown area where there's a lot of activity, then that becomes more of a challenge, and they're removing parking from the street because they want the parking deck used. And so you have to think of people who can't walk very easily, and in weather. And I have great concerns with what both Champaign and Ben are doing with zero setbacks, especially those buildings along University, because there's no place to put the snow.
Right.
Or when we have a heavy rain and the cars drive along University and you're using the sidewalk and you get drowned. And so people naturally, human behavior, use the street because the streets have been plowed. And so those are things to take into consideration. And for years I have strongly urged, as they do in the northern states, we tip our plow blades to the curb. In the northern states, they tip the plow blades to the center. Thank you. So that is helpful for not piling the snow up around parking meters, the ADA cutouts in the sidewalks, all of those issues. And then trucks come through later with scoops and throw it in the trucks, and you remove it from the center. But all the other issues that come because the snow and ice gets tipped to the curb really is very difficult for anyone who has any form of mobility issues.
Well, Neal Street is also a major drag. It's north-south artery
Well,
coming off of 474, and at one stage it was thought that you would stop traffic going through like that by putting in a mall, and it lasted for several years. It took $1 million to put it in, and took $1 million to take it out.
Well, that's because they never finished that, building the design. If you look at the old Condu Flushing design for that mall area, they did not finish it. And so it did become, a clog in the artery without any question. But if they had finished it, they took away two-way on Walnut. You do remember that Walnut was once two-way. And then you have the one-way couple of State and Randolph, which allows people not to have to go through the downtown area. There is sort of a slight one block over bypass to the downtown area. And instead of allowing Walnut to stay two-way, and as when I was on the Center City Commission when Joan Severance was mayor, there are wonderful plans we came up with the redesign of the downtown and using the downtown for the impetus of design following the Boneyard out, going north and south. Well, it goes south and east, but you know what I mean. And that was not done, and unfortunately those plans got lost when Neil Strack, who was one of the people working on this, and Bruce Hutchings had a fire in his architecture office, so those hand-drawn designs got lost, unfortunately. But the point that was looked at is how can you create development starting with downtown as the nucleus and encourage then the development to follow the Boneyard north and south, which would have been a terrific economic development and make it comfortable for people to get through the downtown area. If you want to develop it economically, you want people to be able to get there.
How far north and south was Neal Street turned into this mall? I don't remember it.
Well, the choke point was right there at the corner where Park and Neal intersect, okay, and it was a covered part. But part of the Condu Flushing plan was that there were catwalks to connect those buildings so people like north, like Minnesota, like Minneapolis or Detroit do, all right? And then because Neal Street then was closed, basically, is how they developed Walnut Street. So you could easily do that. And then parking was still available on the streets, so it wasn't such a long distance for people to park and walk. And downtown Champaign, I think downtown Champaign has 3 dedicated handicap parking spots. 3 in all of downtown Champaign. So that makes it difficult for anyone to try to park close. So what is happening with the people who have those challenges, you can be young and have those challenges, or you could be older to have those challenges, is that then they don't go downtown.
So Patsy is running for city council, and so she's knowledgeable about the city council, and I have some questions for you, and we don't have much time.
Okay, we'll do it quickly.
One of them is that many of the things that happen with the council are regional planning in effect. We have a regional planning office which services Champaign County, but regional planning involves an underground aquifer to the Muhammad Ortiz Valley Aquifer, and I just went when they were putting together an appraisal of what Champaign has done and what it might do in the future. And one of the things I would like to see added to that sort of accolade is a recognition of regional planning. Like there's 5 mayors, there's 80,000 people drinking from this aquifer. Mm-hmm. There's sewer situations. Mm-hmm. There's polyvinyl chloride things. Mm-hmm. How do you see regional planning fitting into the various cities?
Well, obviously, as an urban planner, really the focus of planning ought to be regional. Because again, back to what I previously mention anything any entity does, be it the city or you do something to your site or I do something to my site, has fallout and it affects other people. Just to clarify for your listeners, there's no longer any regional planning. There hasn't been planning in the Regional Planning Commission for decades. So the planning happens for the county in the county planning office, and that's John Hall. And then for the municipalities, they each have their various sets of planning. There is a regional planning commission where entities representing the municipalities and the villages do sit and talk, but it isn't that they're talking about how do we plan for design and things like that. The RPC now is more a social service agency. So your question has got validity, and that is, how do we sit down together, all of these entities?
I want 10 counties. We're putting in rail
right, I know.
trails,
Yes.
and they're taking out the very last of our only prairie that's left.
Well, that did once exist. You remember that there was grant money that came to the RPC where it wasn't 10 counties. I think it was only 5, but I could be mistaken on that number. Could have been more. But anyway, when that funding ran out, that entity of at least the county sitting around the table on a quarterly basis talking about what is happening in their counties no longer happens.
And I almost feel that it's not likely to happen because nobody wants to be told how to operate their overall county plans. It's very confined to the jurisdiction of the city or the town or the voting behavior number of years. What I'm thinking of is a planning device which is regional that also relates to the state.
Well, I have suggested when I was sitting on the RPC commission that the RPC be dissolved per se, and that it become a COG, a Council of Governments, which is what you are talking about basically. And a Council of Governments then, because of that structure, has more latitude than the structure of the present RPC, the way it is set up. And being a Council of Governments, then they could have these conversations that you are talking about and reinstate is probably the word to use, planning from a regional perspective, because we all affect each other. In fact, I just posted on Facebook a quote that somebody that I was listening to on C-SPAN said, entities, meaning municipalities or villages, thinking or arguing they have enhanced their economic development because they have gotten a business from a close-by entity is not economic development if we are looking at the region. And that's very important for us to look at the region. We all need to work together, and our tax dollars are very tight, and we don't have many mechanisms to increase our tax dollars, be whatever way you might approach the voter to do this. And so how do we best use our tax dollars that are presently coming to us? And it's to become more efficient in how we plan or how whatever we're doing, so we stretch our tax dollars. I don't mean do things in a very only top layer, still have the depth to it, but because we're being more efficient, we can continue to do it in that manner.
It goes to the national level. There are 23,000 miles of rail trails now, and there's a move to connect those across the country.
Right.
And each city, if you want to connect Danville to Decatur to
Right.
Bloomington,
There's cost sharing is what you're saying.
cost sharing, but it's also something to do with the ecology. Do you make these corridors so wide that you take out the ecology on either side?
Yes. You're talking about it's necessary to have a grand plan.
Yes.
Yes.
And I wonder if that grand plan exists in the rail trail movement, which has come about because people were losing railroads to abandonment, and the bicycle people are being used to preserve the corridors.
I can't speak to that, but he's
30 seconds.
okay. I can say that in Colorado they're building that kind of trail from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs, and they are doing that.
Okay, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign. And this is Patsy Petrie, and thanks very much for coming in.
And again, I apologize for my tardiness.
Oh, that's due to the weather. So thank you for coming, and David's on the board.
Dave on the board, and as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.